Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here, and today we are going to explore sociological perspective on race relations, trying to unpack some things, provide some perspective, different concepts, theories, ideas related to race. As you kind of get the idea where we've gone in this class so far, start off the class first few weeks, kind of foundational concepts, theories, ideas, all the way from the micro level to the macro level. Then we moved into deviance and stratification, very specific topics. And now we're going to dive into race and next week, gender. We do offer class SOC 212, Sociology of Race, Class, and Gender. If you're interested in these topic areas, I encourage you to take that class. We just kind of dive in deeper into the subject area in those classes. The goal here is to provide, some big picture ideas, give you food for thought, put some concepts, theories, ideas to things that maybe you thought about before, maybe introduce some new ideas. We'll draw from history and then look at history to basically to better understand the present and kind of like, work between those two realms of the past and the present. Okay, so starting off, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this idea that race is real in the sense that we see it as being real. So it's like this social construction thing, but it's not genetic. There's no biological foundation for the ways that we think about race. Race is, as we know it, has no deterministic biological basis. At the same time, it has real life or death consequences. It has real consequences, right? Because even though it's arbitrary, even though it's not real from a biological viewpoint, a genetic viewpoint, it's real because we've defined it and we've viewed it that way. So let's kind of talk about the emergence or the establishment, like when did this idea of biological races originate, and what was the context around that? Prior to the development of enlightenment or the age of science, the age of reason, kind of go back, you could say transitioning 1600s, 1700s, developing scientific ways of knowing. Races in terms of biological races did not exist in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, or other ancient societies. It's a modern day conception. That doesn't mean that in places like Greece or Rome that they didn't differentiate, that they didn't engage in sort of some tribal distinction between different groups. They did, but they didn't. Those conceptions were based on what we talk about, maybe ethnic differences in language, differences of where regions where people came from, cultural practices that were different between different groups of people, but they didn't define or view individuals in terms of being biological races. And that's a key distinction to make. One of the things that the emergence of biological races, it coincides with the development not only of science, but and science is related to exploration, of exploring the world exploring the world, colonization, exposure to the broader physical world and landscape and peoples that occupy those particular spaces. And colonization, the expansion and deployment of countries, of European countries, for example, of England, the Dutch, other countries moving into the world, right? So they're colonizing, taking over, staking claim in other countries. So this idea of biological race emerged during that time period. So the question in some ways, is it coincidental? And I think there's a relationship between the two. Science is going on, technology is developing, affording the opportunity for further exploration and development to encounter new lands, also to acquire resources in those lands. So colonizing those particular areas in order to extract resources, and in that process, it's subjugating individuals from those countries. So biological ideas of race provide some justification of that subjugation and that extraction of resources and sort of the domination of one group over another. So biological conceptions provide an ideology, a belief, a rationalization for justifying that domination. So what I show you now is basically some diagrams, some pictures from one of them is from a book called Types of Mankind in the 1850s. And then kind of draw back even further, Carl Linnaeus, an anthropological examination. And he's kind of seen and identified as sort of really the person who creates classification systems. So classification in terms of if you've taken biology, classification systems from the biological world and applying them now into the social world and differentiating, identifying different groups in terms of being different species and different races. So that's emerging in the 1700s. I mean, you could draw back. There's been work that sort of draws back to earlier time periods where some ideas of biological races are forming, but it doesn't really form until the 1700s. Linnaeus kind of provides a lot of, I don't know, a lot of support, a lot of thought, a lot of what he's identifying as sort of this evidence of these different species, these different races. You can kind of see from this depiction, these two depictions here, the racism that's built within this kind of biological conception idea and idea. If you look at Linnaeus's work, you kind of see that in Linnaeus's work. He identifies different racial groups with Caucasians being the most supreme of the group. So there's a hierarchy that's built within this. And you can really see it in Knott and Giddens' work here in 1854, Types of Mankind, where you see that this sort of idea that the African individuals from descent from Africa, although we are all descendants from Africa, but this idea that the Negroid, that particular race, is closer connected to the primate world. And you can see the hierarchy, the primate, the sort of middle ground area in terms of evolution. And this is the highest form of evolutionary form, is sort of ancient Greek, ancient Roman sort of picturesque sort of idea of higher level thinking, higher level of consciousness, decision-making, less prone to animalistic tendencies. And these would be the kind of the ideas that are being offered by Knott and Giddens. This is a really interesting depiction because, I mean, because it gets that hierarchical perspective, evolutionary perspective, and thinking about race during this particular time period. And also this depiction contains very blatant misrepresentations, but the scientists Giddens and Knott were not aware of how they're misrepresenting the face and the human skull. And so, for example, you can see, like, if you compare the skull with the actual head here, it's fairly well connected. There's a resemblance here. There's no, it's incredibly distorted. And even this is not the same either. Even the positioning of the skull, this one is a full-on side view. This one's actually rotated a little bit, so give you sort of the appearance, the perspective that this is a longer jawline. And the work of Stephen Jay Gould, anthropologist, The Mismeasured Man, a really fascinating book about the development of these ideas that we're trying to measure and understand humans. And getting into race, class, he gets into race, class, and gender, about how scientists were creating this sort of ways of understanding. And what Gould's argument is that things like Giddens and Knott in their work, scientists were unconsciously reproducing their own biases, their own viewpoints, their own perspective, their own ideologies in the work that they did. They believed they were being, that the evidence they were producing was valid evidence, that it was objective, it was empirical. They didn't recognize that they were reinforcing in unconscious ways this way of thinking and knowing. You may be wondering what this sort of bottom diagram here is. This is a depiction of the Black Irish. This depiction of the Irish, and the reason I included it here is that within each of these different, like where do groups belong? This idea of the Black Irish sort of emerged, and even see sort of like this idea of even what individuals that we identify as being white today weren't always viewed as being white. So it's kind of trying to demonstrate here that these categorizations, these ways of thinking, are fundamentally flawed. So we talk about them in this term, scientific racism, how science is reproducing these ideas of racist thought. We can see it, in this idea of civilization, right? So savages and civilization is kind of implying this sort of, not only implying, but it's speaking to this sort of hierarchy that's developed, this idea of one species being better than another. And those ideas, they're historic relics in one way, but they continue on in contemporary society. This book here on the right, The Bell Curve, written by Herrnstein and Murray, came out in the 1980s, very controversial. And the controversial aspect of their work is they were making this connection that the reason for certain racial groups not achieving greater success, more likely to be engaged in criminal activity and other bad activity, was a result of genetic connections to race or to class. And so these ideas continue and remain with us within culture. So I like to think about, culture as this moving thing, right? That things become part of culture, they become institutionalized. Things do change over time, but in some ways, this is a case where these ideas, if we still have remnants of that past that we carry forward into the present, in our present ways of thinking. So we look at the past, try to understand this sort of biological idea about race, so we can better understand how people thought about in the past, how we understand how race got embedded within society, the reasons why. And so then we can kind of better understand some of our current struggles and challenges in thinking about race, and how some of those ideas of the past are still part of the present in different ways of thinking. Okay, let's talk about now the sort of idea of social construction of race. We've talked about it before, but let's kind of bring it into the perspective and thinking about race. So this is a sort of a fundamental book about social constructionism. It came out in the 1960s, sort of this piece of philosophy of thinking about this sort of idea about how we construct meaning. So I'll kind of hit some main ideas about this. Well, the first part is that all constructs, thinking about gender, sexuality, think about how we develop systems of thinking. Those constructs are human creations. They don't exist in the objective world or the lived world. These are inputted from humans. They're created by humans. And that we develop these constructs, and then we start to view the world through these constructs, right? So you could look at gender, for example. Different cultures have different meanings associated with gender. Those gender constructs are culturally specific to time and place. And people tend to view the world, if they're socialized into those constructs, view the world through those particular constructs. Berger and Luckman, the authors of Social Construction of Reality, argue that, or advance the idea that constructs tend to get stabilized through institutions, through day-to-day life. We become socialized into them. They become normalized. And part of that's a shared system of meaning that we develop within a nation or a social group or a place. So constructs become solidified. They become natural. They become taken for granted. That they become somewhat invisible because we see that these are just, we come to define them as just being truths. This is the way things are, right? And what their perspective that they offer too is that we create this meaning through systems, the symbolic world, through meaning that we are developing through language, and also through our social habits, the ways we think, the ways we know, the ways that we do, the ways we interact, how we confirm particular ways of thinking about the world through our social interactions with individuals, with groups, with institutions, within society itself. And so eventually this way of constructing the world becomes viewed as being real. So we got to recognize that it's the meanings that we associate with things are arbitrary, means there's no empirical, objective reason for a particular meaning system. So it's arbitrary, it's not set in stone, it's not determined, it's not actually coming from the physical world itself, it's sort of coming from humans, it's arbitrary. But yet it's real because we have these constructs and ways of thinking that we develop, and we see the world through that lens, and then we institutionalize it, and then it becomes this thing, it becomes very real. So this is the idea in some ways of the Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem, if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So going back to that interactionist idea between the stimulus and response is the interpretation. So here we're thinking about the interpretation. We respond to things based on our interpretation of things, not based on the actual stimulus or the actual object, but based on our interpretation of it. So ideas are created by human, they're arbitrary and flexible. It doesn't mean they don't exist in our perceptions, imaginations, attitudes, and behavior. We're all part of this human community, so different groups are going to be viewed in different ways, labeled differently, and provide some different examples of this. Tiger Woods, in a interview on Oprah Winfrey Show, talked about his racial identity being Cablinasian, that he has Caucasian, Black, Indian, and Asian. So his mother and father come from different histories. And so he was recognizing this fact that he is not, that isolating Black and Blackness is only one aspect of his racial self. And it was a little bit controversial, and I don't want to get into the controversy of that, of his identification in terms of being Cablinasian, but it's a sort of interesting idea, right? Or exposes this idea that we've constructed these ideas about Blackness in America. We talk about it as a one-drop rule, that one drop of African descent, lands you in the category of being Black. And Tiger Woods was kind of pushing up against that a little bit. Other examples, Ted Cruz, we identify him maybe as being white, although he has Latinx history. Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, Dutch American would be a different way. That would be another way of categorizing Colin Powell. Although it's sort of the idea that he is an African American, he is a Black American. So this idea that what constitutes being Black, what constitutes being white, Hispanic, all these different kind of things are illustrating, identifying that these are social constructs, right? They're arbitrary. This is a really interesting book, Isabel Wilkerson, talking about caste and looking at America as a caste system, that class and race are deeply embedded in our history, and that we live in this sort of caste perspective or caste system. And what I brought up here is a quote after she gave a talk. Somebody came up to her after she gave a talk, and this person said, there are no Black people in Africa, and kind of stunned her for a second. And, of course, she thought about it, that this statement doesn't make a lot of sense in one ways. But I mean, here she says, most Americans are weaned on the myth of drawable lines between human beings, that we can accurately draw these lines. They have to sit with this statement for a while, that there are no Black people in Africa. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course, there are Black people in Africa is what we think. There is a whole continent of Black people. How could not anyone see that? And then this person who came up to her after the talk said, Africans are not Black. They're Igbo and Yoruba, different tribes within Africa. They are not Black. They're just themselves. They're humans on the land. That is how they see themselves. That is who they are. And they become Black when they immigrate or migrate to areas where cultures and societies have defined groups along these sort of lines. A couple of books you can if you're really interested, The History of White People, Nell Irvin Painter, really fascinating kind of book, just sort of about these development of these ideas of biological race, and then developing ideas about whiteness as well. And then Lopez's work on White by Law, about how the legal system reinforced particular ideas about race. We could look at social construction. I think, look at the US Census, where let's say before the 1970s, 1980s, really sort of seeing that, probably the census had this view of distinct biological races, and reinforcing that through it was institutionalized and became part of the census system. And now the census recognizes that these are social definitions, not an attempt to define race biologically. Categories of race are social, cultural constructions, and we can kind of recognize that today. Another example, like one of the problems of categorizing in terms of like a racial group is it homogenizes the complexity of the world. So you look at Asian American as a broad category, and we see the world through that category. And what we don't see then are the distinctions between different groups underneath that particular umbrella. Each of these different groups have a different experience. This data is a little bit dated, but it doesn't really matter in the sense of the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look at income level and poverty rate of different groups that would be defined as being Asian American, we see a lot of different varied experiences. And part of this is related to the background of individuals or different groups when they immigrated to the United States. You know, was it seeking political asylum? Was it because of disruption by war? Was it for economic opportunity? What was their class background, their social background before immigrating to the United States? So with this, you can see that there's a complexity of groups underneath this sort of Asian American kind of umbrella. So when we categorize, we've constructed this idea, right? We start to see the world through that particular perspective. And sometimes we because of that, we miss the complexities of the way the social world really operates. I think another interesting comparison is looking at, you know, in America, we have what we call the one drop rule regarding sort of this idea of the white and black divide, about individuals who are black have one drop of African descent. I mean, it's faulty in logic and reasoning, but that's sort of how we culturally, it's been embedded within our history. And we still struggle with that to some extent today. In Brazil, talk about it as a color gradient. It's not a, you know, sort of, there's a lot of variation, a much more variation. So they see the world through a much more complex constructs, more nuanced constructs. There's still ideas about race for sure within Brazil. There's still division and separation within Brazil. They just have a different system in thinking about and categorizing race. So now we kind of move to some of the contradictions of these biological ideas about race. This picture here is from a pamphlet, a book titled An Octoroon. So person who was one eighth of African descent. And this is really interesting, right? So during a time period in American history, 1800s, specifically, you know, we start to, after emancipation, start to create this language system. Going from a person who was a half, a quarter, an eighth, in this case of octoroon, a 16th, a 32nd, and these different these different words or categories that were developed to identify individuals in their racial genetic history. It's illogical. These are human creations and human categories. Susan Gilroy Phipps is an interesting kind of case study in a way. She went to apply for a visa or a passport. She was going to travel outside the country. She went to apply for a birth. She needed to get her birth certificate. She got her birth certificate, and on her birth certificate, it said that she was colored. And so she advocated for changing the designation from colored to white. She never knew that designation. She always saw herself as being white. She was raised in a white family, in a white community. She saw herself as being white, and her identity is around whiteness. And it didn't make sense to her that she was identified as being colored. So she brought her case through the legal system in the state of Louisiana. She is 1/32 of black blood, of African descent. Her grandmother, great grandmother was a woman slave. And the Supreme Court in the state of Louisiana denied her petition, denied her case, and said, you know, that even though it's arbitrary, the designation stands. So it's what's the logic in that? 1/32, you know, kind of raises the question. These ideas, the logic kind of carries us to different things too, that there was a belief for a period of time about the mixing of races. We created policies that were anti-miscegenation policies. Miscegenation is the mixing of races, so policies that were geared up towards prohibiting the mixing of races. This is directed at Chinese, Japanese, African Americans, different racial groups, different time periods, with these ideas in terms of keeping the races separate. This is related to eugenics, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Was it all the way until, so 1924, the Racial Integrity Act, you can read that there, created this legal precedent for forbidding or banning interracial marriages. And there was a fear of the consequences of the mixing of races. 1950s, this flyer here that was in communities in the South, I thought it was just really interesting. There was 1950s, think about the migration of African Americans coming out of the South during the war years, both for work and labor, as well as for work in the military. And there was development of youth culture, things were going on, right? The people were moving, culture was changing and shifting, and there was this fear that through Negro music, through Black music, that white youth and Black youth would develop relations, and this would be problematic. And so there's this petition trying to encourage parents to prevent their youth from listening to Negro records. So, I mean, just really fascinating. All the way to 1967. So the case of Loving versus Virginia in 1967 put an end to banning interracial marriages. I mean, it's a fascinating history, to think about that. And these ideas are related to eugenics, U meaning good and genetics meaning genes, and this idea of promoting a better society through the promotion of good stock or good genes within society itself. And this led us into very problematic areas, sterilization of groups of people, social engineering to try to create this better society. In Edwin Black's book, he does a really good job of going through the sort of development of eugenics and the idea of eugenics, its origin, and then how it became institutionalized in society itself. And eugenics, is not only a project in the United States, but also in a lot of European countries. The case down here in the bottom right is looking at Australia. The film Rabbit Proof Fence is a really fascinating film, looking at sort of a film based on a true story of Aboriginals in Australia who were taken away from their community and that were brought into a boarding school and home. And the idea was that the Australian government believed that they could, after 3 generations, they could inbreed white genetics into Aboriginals and create and develop remove the Aboriginal and create white citizens. I mean, this sort of idea, it's illogical, right? It's contradictory, it's illogical, it doesn't make sense, but this is what was going on during that particular time period. I want to introduce this idea of passing as well, because I think it's kind of an interesting historical relic, kind of tells us a little bit about these ideas about race, and how we can get these really interesting illogical notions, but they generate fears and reactions and responses, that it's much more than it's not about the objective idea about passing, but it's all these other things that are going on in the context that are shaping these things. So the idea of passing was that a person could be of African descent, but pass as being white. This was 1950s where this concern became really elevated. So the context was that, of migration of African Americans out of the South, more interracial interactions going on between whites and Blacks. Blacks were moving into different positions within society itself. There was the development and the rise of the civil rights movement that started in the 1950s. And, we got to also put 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. So the ending of legal segregation of public facilities. So moving towards integration within public facilities, all these things are going on. And during that time and context, there was a concern among some, and that was being promoted by political leaders, by scientists, by others at the time, that there's a fear that people could pass as being white. These are 2 individuals who could pass as being white. And then what would happen if they were to be involved in an interracial relationship, and that resulted in a pregnancy and the birth of a child. So Pinky was a movie. Elia Kazan, who directed Streetcar Named Desire, also directed this film. This is a film about a mother and a daughter. This is a mother and a daughter. She is passing as white. She grows up in the South. She moves to the North to go into nursing school. She trains as a nurse. And then she comes back home and introduces her white boyfriend to the family and the community. And during the film, they become romantically involved and they kiss each other in one scene in the film. That film was banned in Marshall, Texas, and then a court case followed, went up all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. whether or not the city could ban the showing of that particular film. The actors were identified as white, and it was this idea that a white and black person were kissing in a film that created that controversy. This is the Carnegie Institute produced this document to try to alleviate public concerns about passing. So kind of walk through it here a little bit and point out some of the illogic kind of behind this and sort of how it was kind of, came out of a fear-based sort of thing, came out of illogic and kind of reinforced particular ideas about race. So here we have this idea of a white man, a mulatto woman, half white, half black, white man, white woman. They have children. They have 4 children, boy, black, girl, half black, boy, half black, girl passes for white. Then we have white boy, white girl, white boy, white girl. Then they have a white baby. So Carnegie Institute is trying to alleviate this concern about what would happen if these two were to marry and have a child. They would have a white baby. Interesting here, though. Look at the depiction is distorted. There is racist components that are built into this particular depiction. There's some social class things that are going on here in terms of white man, the 2 white men. Very feminine, very blonde, blue-eyed sort of idea. White woman mulatto very masculine. Hard to know that she is a woman. So we got sort of these sort of representations are problematic. Even the language, here we have boy black, here we have white boy. So we put in the gender first and the race second. So raises the question like why this sort of reversing things around. If the boy's half black, they're also half white too. So what's going on? Like this, these are arbitrary kind of notions and ideas, kind of both illustrating this sort of this social construction idea, as well as the illogic behind it and the consequences behind some of these ideas about race. The other thing to talk about, kind of move into a different topic and more contemporary society, I think we look at that stuff in the past and we can recognize a little bit more objectively because we have historical distance. Our culture has changed and shifted. The way that we think has changed and shifted. We can recognize the illogic of that, the scientific racism behind that. We can see that that's a world of the past, even though there may be remnants today that society has moved in a different direction. And we still have racism in society today. And, it's how we think about it. That's how we approach thinking about racism becomes kind of the key thing. Starting in, if you go back to 1954, go back to the Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation of public facilities, 1960s, the March for greater racial equality, the March on Washington, Martin Luther King in 1963, cultures moving, changing, shifting. No longer became less acceptable to be overtly racist, to communicate ideas about race that were remnants of the past. And what happened or what changed in culture, if there's a sort of fear, if there's a change in norms of what's acceptable in terms of communicating ideas about race, people may still hold on to those particular beliefs, but now they communicate in coded language, communicate in different words that hide the ideas of race behind some of the thoughts and beliefs and ideas that individuals have. And this is the idea of colorblind racism. And this idea of colorblind racism as a concept and idea emerges in the 1980s and 1990s. I think probably we could probably, I don't know, this term could be updated a little bit. I think that it's still part of society today. I think we recognize colorblindness as racism today in ways that we didn't in the 1980s and 1990s. It was more common in the 80s and 90s for people to say things like, I don't see people, I don't see color, I just see people. And that's sort of this sort of colorblind notion, colorblind racist notion. While the sentiment of just seeing, I don't see color, I just see people, while the sentiment behind that may be, I just see people, the humanity in all of us, is a noble thing, is a valuable thing. The idea is that we do see color, we do see race, and it denies that idea denies the reality of the experiences of different groups. So it may be well-intended, but it has problematic consequences. It denies the realities in which people live. Eduardo Bonilla Silva has done a lot of work with the idea of racism without racist And this is just I don't know, a quote that kind of gets at his idea that in this world, post civil rights movement, now the question is, how do whites explain the contradiction between being colorblind and the way that race reinforces inequality? And he contends that whites developed a powerful explanation, a justification for racial inequality that removes any responsibility them from any, as a racial group, not individually as a group, from any responsibility for racial inequality. And he talks about as the ideology is this idea of colorblind racism. So the ideologies that start to become developed, that people start to develop, or we develop in society that reinforce racism, are not overtly ideologies that communicate ideas about race, about racial hierarchies, or that one group being better than another biologically or culturally. But we've developed in a contemporary society, developed these new explanations that don't appear to have ideas about race embedded within them, but they are. So we can kind of talk a little bit further about this, sort of maybe that would become a little bit more clear. And, the Bonilla Silva, I've always thought, a couple key things about his work, and when this quote, I think, kind of captures part of it, is that looking at racism and looking at institutional discrimination, it's not about looking at the individual. It's not looking at individuals, but looking at things at more macro level, group level, macro level kind of processes. So racism, what Bonilla Silva talks about, doesn't come from the heart of races. So it's not like, okay, racism is reinforced by individuals who are racist. It's like we're all involved and implicated in the system in some way. But from the fact that dominant actors, so it doesn't come from racists, but the idea that dominant actors, those in positions of privilege and advantage, they receive the benefits of this sort of racialized order, and individuals may not recognize it. They may not see it. They may not see the ways in which privilege happens and works within society, or the ways in which subjugation and domination happen. Doesn't mean it's like it comes from the heart of an individual being racist, but rather this lack of attention, this lack of awareness, this lack of engagement and understanding about race. And I think that's important. So we don't demonize individuals who are not engaged in understanding these particular ideas, but we're trying to understand basically how individuals may develop ideas that are reinforcing these ideas of racial inequality. This colorblindness idea reinforces privilege and advantage. It reinforces subjugation or domination. It reinforces systematic inequalities, right? Because it becomes colorblindness that, if we identify a particular policy, like for example, the war on drugs, during that time period, there was an approach to sentencing during the war on drugs called determinate sentencing, meaning that judges had to give, there was like a guidebook that if a person had a certain amount of possession of a certain drug, they were provided a certain sentence. It was determined. So judges didn't have any leeway. And judges did not like this system because it constrained them, because it couldn't take into account an individual's prior history and the context around the particular offense. During that time period, there was the determinate sentencing. There was one sentence or guideline was that a person that was caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine got the same sentence as a person who was in possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. Powder cocaine associated with white, middle, upper class. Crack cocaine associated with inner city people of color, predominantly. And that policy, that law, could be viewed as being colorblind, like it's just sort of there's no race within that. And what that does, it hides the realities that how race was part of the way in which that law was formed, or those determinate sentencing were formed, and how that system of 100-to-1 ratio, or the 500-to-5, resulted in basically disproportional impacts on people of color and communities of color. And so colorblindness works to maintain racism within society and systematic inequalities. Racial outcomes it's not the individual. It's about practices that are engaged in at the interactional level, the group level, as well as at the structural level. Contemporary racial ways of thinking and knowing are much more covert. They're covert in our discourse, the ways that we talk, the ways that we present information. People talk in coded language more today. People avoid talking about race. It's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about, although it's really important to talk about race. People feel concerned, about that they're engaging in the right language, the appropriate language, how they may come across. So it's this anxiety a little bit about talking about race that sometimes it prevents us from engaging in good talks about race. And in some ways, it becomes more invisible. The way that racism operates, it's less overt, therefore it's a little bit less visible than it was in the past. We could look back to things like passing or eugenics and we can see that. It's harder for some to see it today, the existence of racial inequality. I put this here to kind of get at this, right? So this idea of statement that affirmative action is a negative interaction, only racists consider race, is very much about this sort of colorblind racism idea. That the number one recipient of benefit of affirmative action are actually women. There's a lot of misunderstanding about affirmative action. And policies that are actually geared and directed towards addressing racial inequality are not racist. They're actually trying to address racial inequality. And we have to be able to understand and examine and address racial inequality itself. So we have to engage in discussions about race. Removing discussions about race and saying we shouldn't consider race is actually this idea of colorblind racism. I don't see color, but people tell me I'm white. Everybody has a racial identity. Whites have a racial identity. People of color have a racial identity. Our identities are different. They're developed differently. They develop in a different context. But even so, this T-shirt kind of getting at is this person may not see themselves as being white. They say, oh, I don't have, race isn't an important feature of everyday life. But the reality is that person has a white identity. Even if they don't recognize that identity, they have an identity around whiteness. Proposition 54 came about in California. I think it was the 1980s, I think it was the 1980s. And basically is a sort of the colorblind initiative. And the perspective was that in the state of California, they would not, there was a proposition that the state government would no longer collect data on the race of applicants for college, for contracts with the government, for anything to do with the government, that the government would no longer collect data, city, local, and state government would no longer collect data on the individual race of an applicant. And it seems like this idea, it's like the colorblind initiative, the idea and the sentiment was that if we don't collect, if by identifying race, we're reinforcing the value or we're reinforcing ideas of race, we're creating division and separation by doing that. It sounds really positive and valuable at face value. The critique of policies like this is that these policies, if we're not collecting the data, like if you look at college admissions, for example, if we're not collecting data on the applicant, the race of the applicants, we're not being able to identify the degree in which race actually interacts with those institutions. And this would be a move, like policies like this would be a move to remove from our view the way in which race and impacts people's experiences. So that's kind of, the idea. And then we can kind of move into a structural analysis, which I think, kind of trying to identify here in a lot of ways that we're moving outside, like with the Eduardo Bonilla Silva, it's not the individual, right? It's not about the racist or the individual. It's about institution, structure, interactional level. It's much more complicated. It's much more macro level. This definition of racism, I think, is a really good one from a sociological perspective. It's an ideology, a belief system that gives different statuses to different groups based on perceived differences. Races are not inherently unequal, but through a system of racism, we define them as being unequal. There's no genetic biological foundation from that for ideas about race. Discrimination based on these ideas of inequalities is a product of racism. So discrimination follows from racism itself. So racism is the bigger umbrella, the bigger driver to institutional or individual level discrimination. Institutional racism permits inequalities in legislation, education, public health, and allows for spreading the ideas about race and racialization within systems of everyday life. It creates these power dynamics that reinforce differences between the dominant group and inferior or subordinate groups. So racism, moving away from the individual, or moving into structure, culture, institutions, and thinking about it that way, and thinking about how racism, white supremacy, white nationalism, these ideas are actually they are sort of the epicenter from which all these other things spring. The concept of anti-racism included more and more over the last, 5 years. I mean, that term's been around for a lot longer than that, but really has become part of our conversation more and more. That to be neutral, to not be engaged in understanding racism is not it's not changing the system, it's reinforcing the system of inequality. And anti-racism is about engaging and understanding the ways in which racism operates in order to challenge, change, and create a more equitable society. It's more built on our foundations of democratic principles of equality, freedoms, and other aspects of our kind of democratic principles. Looking at also from that structural level that we think about racism, we have to think about racism as a system. It's a system that includes both privilege and domination, and these two things are interactive. So one of the challenges that go, one of the challenges and one of the things to think about in terms of addressing racism, to address racism, you also have to address privilege. Groups who have been in positions of privilege may not recognize the ways in which privilege operates. When engaging in work of anti-racism and trying to change the system is going to require a loss of privilege for those who have privilege. And we're going to get into a struggle now. Because individuals who have privilege, if they don't recognize it, not going to be able to see it. Even if they recognize it, may not, it'd be part of humans not to want to give up privilege and advantage. So we have to have conversations and engage in the work of trying to figure out ways in order to realize these democratic principles and these principles of equality and equity. Last couple of points, thinking about institutional level discrimination. So we think about discrimination at individual level, but also institutional, right? So institutional discrimination can be neutral. So go back to that sort of 500 to 5 ratio. Institutional discrimination. It's no individual actor that's reinforcing that discrimination necessarily. It's the institution, right? So healthcare, housing, education, there's institutional discrimination that are going on within those institutions. It's not about the individual actor, it's about the institutions themselves. And we can look at voter registration, past and present, to kind of get at this in some sort of way, and we'll come back to that here in a second. College admissions is really interesting. There's by far much more privilege advantage for those in the dominant group in applying for admissions into colleges and universities than there is advantage for people of the subordinate group through affirmative action or other college policies that are looking at racial preferences or race conscious application processes. But man, this is a lightning storm of stuff, right? Of getting into the degree to which colleges can consider race in terms of applications. There's a long histories in ways in which elite colleges and colleges and universities engage in the work of protecting advantage and protecting privilege. This happens at the educational level, reinforced at the judicial level in terms of laws and policies, in terms of what's looked at and what's not looked at in terms of the applicants for college admissions. It's also built on these sort of ideas of ideologies and beliefs, this idea that, well, people should be judged by their merit. And they should be judged by their merit. But we have a system, for example, in elite colleges, for one, that applicants, and this isn't only elite colleges, but other universities and colleges, where they take legacy status. So if you had a parent, a grandparent, a family member who went to that university, you got additional points or you got elevated in terms of your application status. Seems colorblind, right? It doesn't seem like that's about race in any sort of way. And just because you have a family member who went there, we can start to see like, well, there's a racial component to this. If you know, if you go back in history before desegregation, you know, there's a reason why there's historical Black colleges, and that's because Blacks were not allowed access to universities, to white universities, other, you know, the dominant universities in society. So if you have families, so whites were able to have legacies in ways that other communities, people from other communities were not. And so that the idea of privileging, this is an advantage that whites have within some university systems. More universities are moving away from that, of removing that legacy status. Elite colleges still have a lot of that status is important, and it's a part of their application process. So anyway, so it's a sort of idea that it's a structural level thing that's going on, that's reinforcing that there's this relationship between privilege and domination, right? And if you're trying to create a more equitable system, a system actually based on merit, you're going to have to deal with removing some of the institutional privilege that's going on within those systems, as much as addressing the institutional inequities that are going on there as well. So let's go back to that, go look at voter stuff. There's a lot of controversy about voter registration in, you know, right now, the past few years, specifically after a Supreme Court case not too long ago that removed some of the power of the Voter Registrations Act of 1963, I think it was. And what that Voter Registration Act of 63 was try to provide protections against discriminating against people, creating institutional processes that were discriminating against people for voting. This is the state of Louisiana prior, 1950s probably. This literacy test these were tests that were common, that applicants for voting had to complete this test. You could look through it and think this is absurd. Not only is it absurd, but it's arbitrary, it's subjective. The person who was the county clerk had the ability to make the call whether or not somebody passed the test. And this was a way to discriminate against Blacks in the South from voting. There's a long history of this. The poll tax, the literacy test, contemporary voter ID laws, they seem colorblind in the idea, this is a good example of colorblind racism as well, that voter identification laws there's a strong case to be made that there's a racial component to that. It's not visible, it's covert. And it makes it harder to substantiate in some ways, to make a clear connection between race and that policy. And it becomes much more contentious in terms of being able to be debatable. But you have, the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan group that's advocating for extending democracy to more people, the right to vote to more people, understands a lot of this stuff as voter suppression, that things that are going on today, the state of Georgia, other places, that these are activism going on within politicians and political organizations that are suppressing the vote for very political purposes. And it's impacting particular demographics, particular racial groups. The final thing is to get into, we'll end up with is the application of our three theories of race, how we can take our three theories of race, or three theories, and apply them to race. We can start with functionalism. Functionalism would have a view, one application of functionalism is that we seek integration, we seek belonging and connection. And it's important for the stability of a social group to have connectivity. People have solidarity, that people have a sense of similar mission and ideas. And sometimes we create these in-groups, out-groups, became oriented in terms of tribal orientation in order to facilitate a sense of group membership. During time periods of anomie, changes in the social order, disruptions in the social order, people maybe kind of go into their group to develop a sense of belonging, connection, solidarity. in some ways, we could look at a lot of the changes that have gone on in the last 5, 10, 15 years, economic, political, social changes, that some people are finding a lot of meaning in terms of particular racial groups. One way to think about the rise of white nationalism, white supremacy, a lot of academic work on understanding what draws individuals into these particular groups has a lot to do with economic dislocation. People, some whites who are disenfranchised, who feel dislocated, find a lot of meaning and purpose within a particular social group. So the functionalist analysis is about that these groups, racial groups, provide meaning and perspective, belonging and connection. One of the challenges is that it could become very dysfunctional. We could become too tribal, ethnocentric in terms of our group orientation, and have a difficult time of understanding other racial groups. The reason I included this book here, Beverly Tatum, who's done work on racial identity development. She's a social psychologist by trade. She's looking at the development of our identities, in this case, racial identities, looks at the development of the processes in which whites develop a racial identity, the process through which African-Americans develop a racial identity and other people of color develop a racial identity. And, our identities are developed within a context. Black kids were sitting together in a cafeteria back in the 1980s, 1990s. There was a move among some principals and school administrators to say, hey, look, you can no longer sit and racially segregate. You can't self-segregate. You have to sit trying to force integration among students. The problem with that is that individuals that come from a group that's subordinate or disadvantaged within an institution, there's value in solidarity. Black kids are sitting together because they can share their experiences. They can develop solidarity. They can belonging and connection. It's a way of managing and learning and supporting each other within institutional life. And so that's sort of this idea of functionalism comes through. The other idea of functionalism is that our ideals that we have in society are a reflection of our value consensus. So Brown versus Board of Education, which came about, and this is, it was a reflection of changing consensus of values, that Americans no longer as a collective said that we could discriminate or provide separate but legal facilities. There was a reaction to that for sure. This is the South 1950s, moving, this sort of reactionary element of trying to maintain that previous order. It could no longer hold on. That group could no longer hold on. Society was moving and changing, more inclusive, more recognition of diversity, and more people are leaning in. I think you fast forward to today, even the last 10 years, our values consensus has shifted. There's more engagement from members of all racial groups, all classes, into understanding these racial inequities and trying to change them. So old ways of thinking and knowing and doing are no longer acceptable for more people. So our value consensus is changing. The problem or challenge of this theory is this theory does not address the issue of social, political, economic power. So it may be it was a consensus for a period of time that Jim Crow South, after emancipation, and then after a time period when Jim Crow South got started, the separate but equal stuff that got started in the South, all the way to the 1950s and even after, was that really a value consensus? African Americans disenfranchised from voting, blocked from being able to vote. This wasn't a value consensus, and functionalism can't deal with that issue very well, the issue of how social groups may take advantage and use their positions of power to reinforce a system of inequality itself. So conflict theory gets you to be able to do that, right? Each of these theories has their benefits and their limitations. We could go to scientific racism and look at conflict theory with that, right? Let's look at conflict theory perspective on that. Scientific racism was a way to an ideology. Biological idea of biological racism was an ideology to help reinforce and to establish and reinforce a system of racial inequality. Martin Luther King, so 1960s, 1950s, 60s, mobilizing people, marching for social change. During that time period, some people viewed him as being a communist, delegitimizing his arguments and perspectives and ideas and his ideals. And, you know, it's like this, because he was pushing up against kind of power, pushing up against the status quo. You know, and there was an attempt to delegitimize his voice, the leadership, the movement itself. The FBI, the CIA was following Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I mean, there was this sort of effort to basically take the wind out of the sails of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We could look at, you know, back in our this is, you know, our history, this is 1920s, a march from the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan on the in Washington, D.C. We have a long history of white supremacy in the United States. It's still part of our contemporary life as well, structures, institutions, and social life. George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida years ago. You know, Trayvon Martin walking around in suburbia where, you know, he's wearing a hoodie under this sort of stand your ground law. George Zimmerman shot him, killed him, and you know, that started a lot of conversations about racial inequities within society itself. Of course, we could look at George Floyd, right? Look at sort of all these different kind of examples where racism existed within society itself. And the idea of conflict theory is that racial inequalities serve power. They are the outcomes of inequality that are embedded in institutions and social life. And to change that, we have to change the distribution of power and resources within society itself. The dominant group wants to maintain that system. This would be the conflict theory argument perspective. The dominant group wants to maintain their position. Sometimes the dominant group will engage in things like scapegoating, where the root of the problem is ignored and a subordinate group gets blamed for the problem. So blaming a victim versus getting at the root of the problem. So if we look at going back to our chapter on social stratification, class inequality, income and wealth inequality, the reality is that social policies, tax policies, other policies that generated by the government that influence that degree of stratification, emerging technologies that are allowing for new ways of producing and production within industry, globalization, competing in a global world, trade agreements between the United States and other countries, North America Free Trade Agreement, Central America Free Trade Agreement, Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, all these trade agreements, all these different things that are going on really impacted the working class. The Democratic Party stopped really representing the working class, starting with Clinton in the 1990s. Clinton, there's been a lot of work talking about the neo-Democrats. The neo-Democrats have moved away from working class issues. So the working class has struggled a lot. And as a result of that, manufacturing's declined. I mean, communities have been impacted by that. A lot of whites have been impacted by those larger macro level forces. Rather than dealing with, those issues in terms of because they would impact capital. I mean, looking at globalization, trade agreements, labor conditions, unionization, all these different kind of things. Rather than dealing with those root problems, blaming a particular group for another group's economic and social woes. So, and immigration is a classic example of scapegoating. And we go back a long way in American history. This is 1880s, the view that the Chinese and the Irish, this is the Black Irish, were going to devour Uncle Sam. And we created policies, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal policy to ban the immigration of individuals coming from China. I mean, these ideas are built on blaming particular groups for other groups' economic and social kind of concerns or experiences. I don't want to make this too complicated here. I'm not going to get into the details of this stuff, but basically trying to identify is that the base, the economic system, in a system of the way capitalism operates in different countries in different ways. If we have a system where power, capitalism in this case, we have the base in terms of manufacturing, the base in what we produce and how we produce, there's going to be inequality built in that system. To maintain that system of inequality requires justification. Racism is one justification. You can scapegoat, the problems on other groups. It's another way of justifying this distribution of resources. To change that, you have to change that arrangement, right? Conflict theory would advance the idea that there needs to be an engagement, or the value, the benefit of engaging in race consciousness of all racial groups, to see their commonalities, that the white working class and people of color have a lot in common. Their economic struggles and their social struggles are related to this larger issue of the way capital is organized and influences social policy in the United States. So to change the system, actually racial groups and different groups have to engage in collaboration in order to challenge the status quo. If racial groups are kept like, this hostility, and politicians can generate that hostility and facilitate that hostility, I think, like white supremacy and white nationalism is facilitating that hostility. And stoking those fires helps to maintain that intergroup conflict, which basically prevents groups working together to challenge the status quo. So, as the last couple ideas, white supremacy sort of embedded in our fabric, maintains the order, competition between resources increases that hostility, and it's looking for collaboration. Unification would be threatening. So maintaining division by those in power, maintaining division, supporting division is a way of maintaining power itself. I don't know. I think we can bypass this. This was just kind of like, just a couple different things. This I thought was a really interesting book. Maybe I'll just speak to it for a moment since it's here. Jason Sokol wrote this book called There Goes My Everything, and there's a really empathetic view of whites in the South. And I so valued and appreciated this book. It provided for me a really deeper understanding of what it would be like to be a member of the majority group in the South during the rise and development of the civil rights movement, and how some whites responded to that, those changes that were going on. Brown versus Board of Education, Voting Rights Act, the move towards greater racial equality, and trying to empathize and understand how whites may have experienced that, or how they did experience it, and responded to that move to greater racial equality. And then finally, interactionism gets us into things like racial identity. The identity for whites, member of the majority group, the dominant group versus people of color, that we all develop a racial identity. The context in which we develop it is different. If you're a member of the dominant group versus a subordinate group, you're going to be differently aware of your racial self. It's going to be more invisible for the dominant group. Interactionism is interested in how we develop meanings, how we develop perspective, that we learn. We learn, our identities is something that we learn. So let's look at the culture, the history, the way social groups influence, how we learn about our identities. Interactionism would also get us into that social construction of race, how we develop meanings about race, how they are tied to history and culture, and to focus on that the meanings that we assign to the social world influence our response to it. D'Angelo's work on white fragility is a really interesting one. I think a really powerful one, getting at when, for some individuals, when confronted with ideas about white privilege or white advantage, and we also have to be mindful that race and class and gender intersect. So not all white people have the same privilege. That class matters, gender matters. So we have to recognize that for sure. D'Angelo addresses this idea of white fragility. Sometimes for some, when confronted with or engaging in, like somebody brings up ideas about racial inequality, they get really defensive, reactionary. And she talks about this term of white fragility. And I find it's really fascinating, of anytime there's defensiveness that we have, for whatever reason, I think it's an opportunity to look within. right? There's an opportunity to look at like, where does that come from? Let me understand that more. But that takes time and investigation and work to be able to do that. Fragility, defensiveness is a way of maintaining protecting one's own worldview. And what she kind of really engages is this conversation of trying to unpackage and understand the difficulty that some people have in engaging in conversations about racial inequities, racial privilege, and racial domination. So it's changing the conversation, the way we think, right? So when I read that book, it's like, man, changes the way I think, and what, different concepts, different ideas, shaping the way we view the social world. This is an image here. This is Stonewall Mountain in Georgia. I went there years ago. And there's a big kind of reception area building here at the front. And there's this long lawn. The Confederate States have flags all down sort of the walkway here. And here's a monument to Confederate soldiers, Stonewall Jackson, General Lee, and Jefferson Davis, I believe, the other depiction. These monuments were erected, many of them. This one goes back 1920s, I think, but it was during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 60s, where it really elevated its status and became this sort of bigger production and support for it by the KKK and white supremacist groups who were supporting the development of this particular monument. So thinking about that, right? Confederate monuments, how we think about Confederate monuments. How do we develop our ways of knowing about Confederate monuments? If we understand the history that a lot of these monuments were put into place during the time period of the civil rights movement and era. And I don't think that's by happen chance. I mean, there's a relationship there. If we know that history, I think that changes our understanding of Confederate monuments themselves. So you get interested in this sort of investigation with interactionism is how do we develop our ways of thinking about Confederate monuments, even if we don't have an understanding of the history of the development of themselves, right? We still develop associations and meanings. So the question for interactionism, like how do we develop those meanings? Where do they come from? What are the social influences? How do they shape our worldview? How are social groups kind of part of that? How is the larger macro level part of that? And just trying to understand both the individual level identity as well as ways of thinking, knowing, and doing. And if you're interested, you can open up the PowerPoint and go to this website. It's an interesting website investigating. There's a project done called the Whiteness Project, interviewing different individuals about whiteness, understanding whiteness, their ideas about whiteness. And it's just really, I think, a really thought-provoking, provocative conversations that people are having about how they understand their own racial identity in terms of being white. All right, that's a lot of great content. Well, I think it's great content. Hopefully you found it valuable and informative. Have yourself a great day, and we'll catch you later on.